Now I would like to present Elena Cîncea, a PhD student from the University of Craiova. Elena is going to talk today about the proportionality of or majoritarianism in search of electoral equity. So let's see if there can be and how there can be equity in electoral system and how that is defined.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Diana told you, my paper is entitled Proportionality or Majoritarianism in Search of Electoral Equity. Through my approach, I bring the spotlight on the old disputes regarding proportional representation or majoritarian system, which is still very actual on the public agenda. As you all know, finding an electoral system both equitable and efficient represents a desideratum for every electoral democracy. And as Royer Collard said, an electoral law is a constitution. Depending on how good or bad the law is, the government resulting from it are strong or weak. Thus, the design of the electoral system is very important because it has important and large consequences upon the constitutional and the political system as a whole. Of course, there are several aspects that should be considered when designing an electoral system, such as the influence it has on political parties, on their political strategies, on government formation, and last but not least, on voting behavior. However, in my opinion, the principle that should guide the electoral engineering should be the principle of equity and fairness. Regarding the content of my paper, first of all, I will address the problem of the concept of electoral equity, which is a very complex notion. I will also set the criteria in order to assess the equity of an electoral system. Afterwards, I will present the principal arguments or counter-arguments regarding the proportional representation and the majoritarian voting system. I will also talk about the effects electoral system have on voting behavior, to be more specific on the psychological freedom of voters. And the next part will consist of my personal conclusions. As for the concept of electoral equity, it is a very intricate concept. Usually, instead of electoral equity, the notion that is used is electoral fairness. However, this concept isn't very clear either. In John Rawls' conception, the principles that should apply to the basic structure of society are justice and efficiency. Rawls said, and I quote, "Justice is the first virtue of social institution, as truth is of system of thought, and it denies that the loss of freedom for some is made right by a greater good shared by the others." As you may know, the principles that John Rawls established to be at the base of society are the liberty principle, which requires equal freedom for all the people, and the difference principle, which entails that any equalities that are encountered in society should advantage the people who are in disadvantaged situations. By a social institution, he understood a public system of rules which defines offices and positions with their rights and duties, powers and immunities, and the like. Considering that an electoral system is it represents the entirety of legal and technical rules designed to turn votes into seats, I consider that an electoral system can be considered social institution. Thus, the design of such an institution should be made in accordance with the principles of equal freedom and equal opportunities. As I have stated before, the meaning of electoral fairness is not so self-evident, and as Adrian Blow points out, there are several conceptions of fairness that should be considered when discussing the matter of electoral system. That is the equality conception, the populist conception, the winner-takes-all conceptions, the majority conception, the plurality conception of fairness. Each of these conceptions lay behind different electoral system. For example, the winner-takes-all conception favors the plurality voting system, which we encounter in Great Britain or in Canada or in the United States. This conception means that only the candidate or the party who gets most votes, even though it is not absolute majority of the votes, should take all the spoils. I mean, should win the election, even though they do not reflect the will of a majority of the people. Considering these different conceptions, one can note that, like most political concepts, fairness is not a matter of all or nothing, but a matter of degree. A definition of electoral equity has been given in a study conducted by the Organization of American States in collaboration with the Institute of Democracy and Electoral Assistance, which alleges that electoral equity entails the existence of conditions of impartiality and freedom in the pre-electoral period, the day of the elections, and the post-electoral period, so that all candidates can participate in a level playing field for political office. I must say that I find this definition very accurate and very comprehensive, and I believe that from this definition can be drawn the conclusion that electoral equity aims to equal opportunities of candidates and also to fair representation of the electorate, these two aspects being, in my opinion, in a very close connection. As for the criteria for assessing the equity of an electoral system, the scholars in this field have been quite reluctant in giving very clear criteria in order to determine the equity of an electoral system. An interesting approach we find at Pierre Martin's research on electoral system, and where he states that in order to appreciate the justice of an electoral system, we should consider three criteria. That is the representativeness index, the monotonicity, and the proportionality. Regarding the first criteria, representativeness index deals with the ratio of voters who are effectively represented in parliament, that is the voters who voted for the candidates and the parties who won the election, and the rest of the voters. Monotonicity requires that the party or the candidate who received the most votes should win the election, and the proportionality, well, this is a more complex criteria, and there are different measures to there are different measures of this proportionality, such as Victor Dont system, Sen-Lag. These two indices of this proportionality concentrate on the ratio between the percentage of votes received and the percentage of seats received by a party. Even though there are different measures of this proportionality, both systems, Victor Dont and Sen-Lag, aim to diminish the disproportionality of an electoral system. But they support different electoral systems. Of course, there are other methods employed to measure disproportionality, such as Loosemore-Hamby, which is the most used one. the Rye index, and the least squares index, also known as Gallagher index. Michael Gallagher had a very interesting study regarding the proportionality of electoral system, and at the end of his study, which included 23 countries in an about 25 years period, he reached the conclusion that every electoral system generates its own disproportionality, but there are also other sources of disproportionality than the electoral formula, such as district magnitude, the distribution of votes between parties, malapportionment, and also electoral thresholds. From all these sources, the most important one, which has the major impact, is district magnitude. In my opinion, the criteria that Pierre Martin set aren't enough in order to determine the equity of an electoral system. Thus, I propose other criteria in order to do that, such as the extent to which the distribution of seats reflects the ranking of the candidates after election, the degree of representativeness of the elected authorities, the compliance with the principle one man, one vote, the representation of minority groups, and the psychological freedom of voters when casting their votes. As for the first criteria, as Nadia Urbinati said, and I quote, "Democratic representation is fair or just representation insofar as it involves issues of advocacy and representativity, issues of a meaningful presence, not simple presence alone, in the game of discord and agreement that is democracy." Thus, ensuring the representativeness of the elected officials lies at the heart of democracy, every citizen having the right to make his voice heard in the legislative forum. Thus, an electoral system should be designed in such a way as to allow as many people as possible to get their will represented in parliament. As for the minority representation, this constitutes an important aspect of electoral equity, and it is also imposed by the principle of pluralist democracy. Fair representation entails a certain relationship of trust between individuals and representatives based on shared experience, perspectives, and interests. Thus, the people who belong to national minorities should have their interests represented by the people who share their same values and traditions. Providing political representation for persons who belong to such minorities implies several aspects. Thus, on the one hand, the electoral law must guarantee equal opportunities for candidates regarding the submission of candidacies, and on the other hand, the electoral system should be designed in such a way that candidates of minority organization have a real and effective chance to get into parliament. That's why many states where there are national minorities have designed a system based on proportional representation, or they have a procedure which entails reserved seats for the organization of national minorities, like the Romanian Constitution, which provides that the organization of citizens belonging to national minorities which fail to obtain the number of votes to be represented in parliament have the right to one deputy seat in the conditions established by the electoral law. The minority representation is also guaranteed by other instrumental other judicial instruments, international ones, such as the Code of Good Practice in Electoral Matters of the Venice Commission, and also the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, and last but not least, the International Convent on Political and Civil Rights. As for the second section of my paper, as I stated before, I present the principal arguments and counter-arguments for these two big different electoral system. So the question is, what should we choose? A majority voting system or a system based on proportional representation? This choice is made practically between a stable, effective, and accountable government, or greater fairness for minority parties and greater diversity in the political representation of social groups. These two big types of electoral system embody the two different visions of democracy as they were outlined by Bingham Powell. That is, the majoritarian vision, in which the elections are regarded as being an instrument of control, the power is concentrated, and the government is very accountable, and the governance is very efficient. Thus, the elections are seen as the final stage to form a government. Not like in a system based on proportional representation, in which usually the governments are formed after the election, after the election, when all the political parties gather and they reach a compromise. It's usually a government of coalition. So the other vision, the proportional one, entails dispersed power, a fair representation of the people, and also the elections are seen as an instrument of influence. Even though it is considered that in proportional representation, the governments, because they are based on coalitions, lead to conflicts and political instability, the practice has shown that that is not quite true. There are exceptions to this rule, such as Spain and Japan, who, even though practice a system based on proportional representation, have had single-party government. And also, on the other hand, there's Germany and Denmark, who have enjoyed stable and lasting coalitions. Sorry? Okay, sorry, I don't know what happened. Okay. Okay. From that, we can draw an intermediate conclusion that government instability is not generated just by the electoral system. There are other factors that influence this government stability, such as the stability and discipline within each political party, the inclusion of minority interests by the existing parties or by the government, and the willingness of political parties to reach a compromise. The same conclusion is encountered in Giovanni Sartori's research on political and electoral system, who states that the stability of a political system is determined by the level of polarization encountered in the society. Thus, in a strongly polarized society, the coalitions will be very heterogeneous. Thus, the governing parties will find it difficult to cooperate with each other, unlike in a relatively non-polarized society, where due to the political parties' loosely defined ideologies, they will easily reach an agreement. Okay, I will try to shorten my presentation. As for the proportional representation, the main quality that is invoked by its supporters is that it tends towards electoral justice, as it allows representation of all currents of opinion and ensures the minority representation in parliament. A renowned professor, Joseph Barthélemy, stated, "The principle of proportionality responds, consequently, to an elementary sense of justice, to a fundamental need for loyalty and truth. There will come a day when we consider the proportionality principle as important as the principle of universal suffrage." Thus, the problem is either choosing what should prevail, a stable and accountable government, or a fair representation of all people and especially minority groups. As you can see, scholars are still divided and they haven't reached a unanimous conclusion. Besides the other qualities of proportional representation that I have talked before, There are other ones, like the fact that it leads to a fair ratio between the percentage of votes obtained by the parties and the percentage of seats they win. That unlike the two-round system, it avoids the electoral kitchen and the false alliances between the two rounds, and that it tends to strengthen national unity, while majoritarian systems deepen these local differences. Thus, even though the fairness of a proportional representation is diminished by setting electoral thresholds, they are necessary to guarantee a certain level of coherence in the legislative assembly. Regarding the problem of the thresholds, there was a ruling of the German Constitutional Court that, regarding the European Parliament elections, that stated that the threshold of 5% violates the principle of equal suffrage and the principle of equal opportunities for all political parties. What is interesting about this decision is that the same court, when deciding about the threshold of 5% regarding the national election, it said that the threshold is complementary to the German electoral system. I mean, it was the same threshold, but because she was dealing with national elections, not European Parliament one, the ruling was different. It was contradictory. In the European Parliament elections, the court said that an argument, and a general and an abstract argument, that the large number of political parties would prevent the shaping of a political will of the European Parliament is not strong enough to have this electoral threshold. When dealing with the German electoral system for the national election, it said that it's okay to have a electoral threshold because the government must enjoy a stability, must have the support of a majority in parliament. That it's a very contradictory ruling. Okay, I will pass that. As for the third section regarding the impact of electoral system on psychological freedom of voters, all the studies that have been conducted on this subject have reached two main ideas: that majoritarian system encourage strategic voting and that proportional representation give voters greater psychological freedom. However, even though it is true that proportional representation extends the psychological freedom of voters, there are also systems that are based on proportional representation who reduce this freedom, like the blocked list system, as in Spain, where people have to choose a list of a party, so the candidates are written down by parties, and the people just have to put the stamp on a list. They have no power of decision regarding the candidates. However, in the proportional representation, like in the context of the two-round voting system, the psychological freedom is slightly more broad. In the two-round system, the first round, electors vote for their favorite candidate, even if they know he has no real chance to win, their vote being a communicative one. While in the second round, their psychological freedom is significantly reduced because they may find themselves in the position to vote strategically. Of all the forms of proportional representation, the most equitable one, in my opinion, is the single transferable vote, which is used in Ireland nowadays, because this system respects the individual candidacies and encourages party to reveal any alliance or arrangements between them. In the same time, the single transferable vote gives voters the opportunity to express a cross vote by selecting candidates who belong to different political parties but have common views on certain issues. Of course, there are other factors that have an influence on voting behavior, as we all know. Thus, the impact of electoral system on voting behavior shouldn't be overestimated, but shouldn't be neglected either, but analyzed according to the particularities of the political system of each country. As for the conclusions, As we may see, both proportional representation and majoritarian system have their qualities and their deficiencies, who drown them away from electoral equity. Bingham Powell suggested that given the benefits and that each model confers, it should be better to succeed with both rather than trading the one off against the other. This desire to combine the qualities of proportional representation and majoritarian system has led to the emergence of mixed electoral system. And the most praised one is the German electoral system. However, this system have also been criticized because even though they tend to electoral equity, they are very difficult and very complex, and the voters don't quite understand them. To conclude with, the answer to the question which is the most equitable electoral system can be neither simple nor categorical, because it depends on a number of factors such as the socio-political context, the degree of democratization, the stability of political parties, and also the existence of national minorities. Therefore, although each state enjoys a wide margin of appreciation in choosing its electoral system, as it was enshrined by the European Court of Human Justice, depending on their political, historical, socio-economic particularities, all democratic constitutions contain either expressis verbis or implicitly a set of binding principles which are relevant to political representation and should serve as guidelines for designing the electoral system. In my opinion, these principles are equal opportunities for political parties, equal suffrage, political pluralism, and free expression of the popular will. Thus, in my opinion, only an electoral system that considers the particularities within each state, but also makes sure that these principles are respected, only a system like that can be considered an equitable one. Thank you for your attention.